So thank you very much. It's great to stand here in front of you and tell you about what I do. I consider this a privilege, in fact, because for the next 45 minutes you need to listen to me and I need to tell you why what I do is worth doing and how it's going to impact the world in the years to come. So I called this more for less, and when we get to the end of the presentation it'll become obvious what I mean by that. But it starts off telling a story about energy, in particular energy in Scotland, and then it moves a whole half world away to India, and then I'm going to end up telling you about food and resources and the impact joining up energy, water and the environment can have in people's lives. So hopefully you'll find it an interesting story. But let's start off by thinking about energy, because there's no doubt that we live in very interesting times when it comes to energy. We're concerned about climate change. We're definitely changing our atmosphere. CO2 levels are rising remorselessly as we burn fossil fuels, and it's going to change our climate. How much and in what ways, we're not sure, but we're pretty sure it's going to do it, and we need to worry about that because we only have one planet and we need to protect it. So at the same time, we need to decarbonise our energy supply, move away from fossil fuels towards low carbon alternatives. Otherwise, that increase in CO2 is just going to continue and make things worse. And at the same time, there's an increasing global demand for energy. Well, how can that possibly be true when we've been trying to save energy for the past 20 or 25 years? In the developed nations, our energy use is actually flatlining, if not going down slightly. But total global energy use is actually on the rise. And hidden behind this, there's actually a success story, because developing nations, their economies are getting bigger, and that drives a need for energy, but that increases the pressure on the environment. And we need to get the balance right there, because we can't prevent them from developing and becoming wealthier. So this is a good news story, but it's also a bad news story, unless we can do something about the emissions that are associated with it. So if you look at this graph here, you can see the green line here is oil consumption. It's not going down, it's going up. And that's driven by China and India and the rest of the developing nations. And the same is true of nearly all the fossil fuels. The red is gas, the grey is coal, yellow is nuclear, and at the top we have hydro and renewables. So even by 2035, renewables are actually going to be a relatively small part of our total energy supply. These figures come from the BP Energy Outlook, which is published every year, partly because of the academics that work here at Heriot Watt, my colleague Mark Schaefer in SOS. So, increasing energy use at a time when we're concerned about the environment. But we also need to remember it's not just about the technology, it's also about people. And if we make energy more expensive, we impact people's lives. 26% of Scottish households live in fuel poverty. And that means that they use more than 10% of their income to keep themselves warm. And that leads to misery, ill health, debt. And in rural areas, it's worse than that. It's 35%. That's a problem that isn't going to go away unless we specifically target making it go away. The gentleman you see here is a chap called Jimmy Murray, who I met 40 years ago in rural Ireland, lived next door or just down the lane from my aunt and uncle. He lived in abject poverty in the countryside. And if we can't bring people, the modern equivalent of Jimmy Murray, along as we develop our new energy systems of the future, then we're doing the wrong things. So that brings me to the concept of the energy trilemma. We're worried about the environment. We're changing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. We're polluting our cities. We're polluting our water. At the same time, though, we need to provide our economies with a secure supply of energy. When we switch the light switch on, we expect the light to light up. So we need that security of energy supply, but we also need to protect the environment, and at the same time, we need to ensure that we do this at a cost that is affordable. And the solutions that we come up with in the future are going to fall somewhere in the sweet spot in there, in that triangle between cost, environment, and secure supply. We need to consider all of these things. So our response so far in the developed nations is we've invested in renewable energy. We've closed down some coal-fired power stations. We've closed down some gas-fired power stations. We've even closed down some nuclear power stations following the Fukushima incident. But mostly in Scotland, we've installed wind turbines. This is a photograph that was taken by one of the Energy Academy students. I ran a competition 2 years ago to see who could come up with the best research pictures, and this was one that was produced by Sierra Campagna, who was a Heriot-Watt University student. So we've installed more wind turbines. What does that do to our energy generation? This is German wind generation for the whole of 2012. So we start here in January, right through to December. At that time, there was just under 30 gigawatts of installed wind energy in Germany. 30 gigawatts, and their peak demand for energy is around about 90 gigawatts. So you could say, well, that's 1/3 of their energy demand, so this is a really good story. But actually, Germany's not that windy a country. And on average, they only produce 18% of their potential production. So although we've installed almost 30 megawatts or gigawatts of generation, we only have 18% of that on average. If the story was just about the average, that would be okay, because we could just build more wind turbines and we'd have a nice constant supply of energy and we could build our economies around that. But unfortunately, this graph is also pointing out that we have huge steps in generation on a daily basis. So we can essentially go from here, 25,000 megawatts or 25 gigawatts to 0 2 days later. So what picks up the difference? Germany shut down its nuclear program, so what they do is they turn up their fossil fuel generation or they import nuclear energy from France. So that intermittency problem is a big problem. It's not just the average energy that's important, it's also the fact that can we build our economy in something that's so unpredictable? I think the answer to that is probably partially we can, but wind energy is unlikely to be the total solution to our problems. So, another problem is this, sometimes the wind doesn't blow and we have no energy, so we have to turn up our gas-fired power stations. At other times, the wind blows and we can't use the energy. Okay? And we can't feed that into the grid because basically the voltage will go too high and you'll start to break things. So in the UK, we have the approach of telling the wind farms to turn their turbines off, to stall them so they stop producing energy. But when they do that, the government, or the contracts that they have with the national grid, leads to them receiving a subsidy. And these subsidies can be quite substantial. One day in October, so last month, £4.8 million was paid out to wind farms to stop producing energy because the energy was produced at the wrong time. So another problem there. This comes from a Times article which was published last month. Okay, so historically, there always needs to be a balance in our energy system between supply and demand. And historically what we've done is we've always just turned up our gas-fired power stations or our coal-fired power stations so that we have exactly the same supply of energy into the grid as we have a demand. And demand is relatively easy to predict, so we can do that quite accurately. But as we move forward into a world where one of our primary energy sources is intermittent, difficult to predict, this is creating new problems that we have to solve. So historically, what we did was we basically turned the knob up. Our gas-fired power station, turn it up. We need more energy, turn it up a bit more. And we can predict this ahead because demand for energy follows a daily pattern, follows the weather, and it makes it relatively easy to predict. That's known as supply management. We manage the supply to meet the demand for energy. Easy when you're turning up a gas turbine, not so easy when you're trying to do it with a wind turbine because we can't turn the wind up. Okay, it does what it wants. We can switch the turbine off, we can stall it and stop it generating, but we can't create the wind when there is none. So, an alternative approach then is that we move away from supply demand management, where we turn up supply to meet demand, and instead we try and change the demand for energy to meet the available supply. And that's known as demand management. So effectively, we turn demand up and down whenever there's energy available or whenever there's a shortage of energy, and we keep the balance between supply and demand so that we don't have blackouts because there's not enough supply, or we don't have the voltage creeping up and breaking things connected to the grid. So that's demand management. If we're going to do demand management well, we need an accurate forecast of generation and demand for energy. And this is where my research starts to come in. And then we can reschedule when energy is going to be used. We can orchestrate it. We can change the timing of demand for energy to match up our demand with our supply. So around about 10 years ago, I was teaching environmental engineering to large groups of third years, and I was telling them about climate change and about energy, and it started to worry me that we were installing so much intermittent generation to the point where I started to talk to colleagues about what can we do about this. And the solution we came up with is, well, let's apply for some research funds and see if we can fix this, see if we can adapt to this intermittent energy generation. So we applied to Brussels for some money for a project known as Origin, which was the orchestration of renewable integrated generation in neighbourhoods. I always think a good research project starts with a good acronym. So Origin. European Commission funded about 4 million euros. And the first thing we did, the people who were involved in first were here centred in Heriot-Watt. And then we got the Fintorn community in Moray involved because they're very into sustainable living in Moray. And then our contacts in Moray put us in touch with a global network of eco-villages. And we picked two. It had to be in Europe. We picked one in Portugal and one in Italy because they have a nice climate and there's nice food there. So it seemed like a nice place to go and do some research. So Damanhur and Tamera. Tamera is about 50 kilometres north of the Algarve, and Damanhur is about 50 kilometres north of Turin on the southern slope of the Alps. So demand management at a community level was what we set out to do. This is the Fintorn community, dominated by wind. You can see in the background they have 800 kilowatts of installed wind generation owned by the community. And it actually produces more energy in total than they can use. But the reality is they still have to import half of their energy from the grid because quite often it's generated when they can't use it, such as in the middle of the night. Around about 150, 200 houses in the Fintorn community and 800 kilowatt of wind. This is Tamera in southern Portugal, near the Algarve. The Italian and Portuguese communities were slightly different. They still had a high proportion of installed renewables, but being in sunnier climes, they had installed a lot more photovoltaic energy. So these are photovoltaic panels here that track the sun in southern Portugal. So actually they were quite complementary. Despite they had good food, I liked that, but they also had complementary energy systems. We could study wind effects in Scotland, we could study photovoltaic predictions in Portugal and Italy. So it worked quite well together. So the concept behind Origin. One of the first things we did was set up the Origin webpage, originenergy.eu. And in the first 3 weeks, we had 26,000 hits to our website, and we thought, wow, this must be a great idea. But it turned out that Origin Energy is actually an Australian utility company. And they were basically getting in touch to complain about their bills. So we quickly changed it to originconcept.eu. The website's no longer live, actually. I checked today, and it's now owned by a Chinese civil engineering company. So somebody must be selling websites out there. Begins with a national obsession, though. This concept of controlling our demand for energy to meet the supply begins with our national obsession, the weather. Can we predict wind patterns? Can we predict wind speed and direction? And can we predict cloud cover? Because if we can predict the generation of energy. Okay? That enables us to forecast wind generation, solar generation, so both ways of generating energy renewably, and also demand for energy, because if we can forecast the weather, we can also know how much energy houses and communities are likely to have, because it's weather dependent. When it's cold, we turn our heating up, or our heating has to work harder. So it's also useful for predicting the demand for energy as well as the renewable supply. So an accurate weather forecast was critical to making this work. Once we had that, so we have generation, we have demand, then we could identify opportunities for demand management. When we first started this, one of the things that was mentioned as frequently was you can schedule when people wash their clothes. But actually it doesn't work like that. People want their clothes washed when they put them in the washing machine. They don't want to wait until tomorrow or the day after to wash their clothes. So actually that was a bit of a red herring. And the opportunities for demand management in the future are likely to be distributed energy storage, perhaps in the form of home energy systems like this Tesla battery. Other manufacturers are out there, but this one makes a lot of noise. Tesla stores about 4 kilowatt hours of energy, that particular battery. In June, I bought myself an electric vehicle, around about 5 years after I first considered it. And the reason I did it was that I now reckon that it makes financial sense to drive an electric vehicle, as long as you have a driveway and somewhere to plug it in. If you do the economics, it now makes sense for me to drive a Nissan Leaf instead of a Volkswagen Golf. So I do, based on finances, not because I think I'm going to save the planet, hopefully I'm contributing to that, but it's because it now makes sense. The technology is moving on. And these batteries that we are going to put into our homes in the future are actually being developed for electric vehicles. Okay, so an electric vehicle is essentially a battery on wheels, and it's an opportunity for demand management, because actually if we all in 2035 go home from work and plug in our electric vehicles, the grid will melt. The Scottish Government is banning the sale of petrol and diesel cars from 2030 onwards. You can sell old cars, but you can't buy a new car if it's not diesel and not electric. That means it's going to be probably electric, possibly hydrogen fueled. If we all go home from work and plug them in at the same time, I did some quick calculations on this, we're going to need to build 5 or 6 new Torness nuclear power stations in Scotland just to charge them. But actually, we probably don't want them charged immediately. If we build intelligence into this system, then all I need to tell the car is, I want my car back on Tuesday morning when I'm going back to work. And the car or the system that it's connected to can then decide, okay, I've got 3,000 cars to charge. I'll do 2 now, I'll do 300 tomorrow. And we can schedule them to keep that peak load down and reduce the future required investment in energy systems. We don't just store energy in the form of electricity, we can also store it in the form of heat. This is a modern storage heater. We spent the past 25 years taking them out of people's houses. I suspect they're going to be coming back again. This is a new product just launched in the past couple of years by Dimplex, a modern storage heater connected to the internet, part of the Internet of Things, and can be remotely controlled to manage the demand for energy. An opportunity, because if we're going to do that, we need to think very carefully and build intelligence into the system so that we make sure we don't impact people's lives when they depend upon a system that's controlled by our intelligence. So how good is our weather forecast? Well, this is work I do with my colleagues from Max, Professor David Corn in particular. This is a forecast for the generation from a wind turbine in Jaw Farm, which is in Fintry, in the Campsie Fells next to Fintry, just north of Glasgow. Okay, and what you're looking at here is the blue line is essentially, if we take the Met Office forecast, which you can get from darkskies.com and other online weather forecast producers, and you inform it of the generation characteristics published by the manufacturer of the wind turbines, then that suggests that this blue line will be the energy that will be produced. And this is over a 16-day period, half-hourly forecast for 16 days. But what actually happens is the red line. So we actually get it hopelessly wrong here for the first 3 days. This is a commercial forecast using the design performance characteristics of the turbine. If we build in the energy forecasting we've created here at Heriot Watt, this is what we get. This is the same period of time. It's the same energy generation. What you can't really see our forecast, you can see the blue line here a little bit, because it almost exactly matches what happened in reality. So this is a weather forecast, roughly the same weather forecast. This time we're using machine learning to tune it using the on-site weather station data and the wind farm generation data. Another useful example of how the Internet of Things is going to make it easier for us in future to optimize systems and predict how they're going to behave. So I think you'll agree, quite a remarkable improvement. Once you have your forecast, if we want people to change their energy use behavior, you need to communicate with them. And what I have to be very wary of as an engineer that I don't try and do that too technically with equations and formula and numbers. So we actually met with the various communities we work with, and we generated what we call an energy user interface. This is the one for Findhorn, and it's trying to communicate to the Findhorn community when would be a good time to wash your clothes or cut the grass or use electricity. And we're doing that here. This is an energy clock, so the time of day here is about 3:20, and it's saying for the next 2 hours, if you use electricity, it's probably not coming from your wind turbine. You'll be importing fossil fuel from the grid. Then you'll be switching to your own renewables. Then the peak demand's going to happen here, so there'll be a problem again. But if you wait till after 7 o'clock for the rest of the night, you'll be using your own wind-generated electricity. And then you have the option of choosing to schedule when you use energy. And this can be reinforced by changing the tariff. And I'll come back to how that affects things in a slide or two. This is the actual weather forecast for Findhorn, giving temperature, wind, cloud level, humidity, etc. And the communities we spoke to are quite arty. They didn't want numbers and graphs. They wanted us to communicate with them pictorially. So they came up with the idea that we would have a plant. The more renewable energy was available, the bushier and healthier the plant would look, from a seedling up to a full plant. So this changes depending on how much electricity is available. The Italian community wanted a stallion here. The Italian stallion. And the Italian stallion runs faster when the sun shines. The more the sun shines, the faster the stallion runs. And that's how they wanted to understand when was a good time to use energy. Okay, so that's it there. Now, unfortunately, that's no longer live, so I'm going to try something I should really have tried before I started the lecture. This is a live link to Smart Fintry, not Findhorn. Fintry is in the north side of the Campsies. Findhorn is on the Moray coast. And this should take us to a link which will show us a live picture of what's happening right now in Fintry. There we are. So you'll see when you speak to the community in Fintry, they didn't want an Italian stallion. They wanted a galloping stag, and here he is here. Earlier on today, he was moving at some old lick, and he was galloping across the screen because it was windier, but the wind's now dropping. And if you look at what's going on here, we have demand dropping, but also the supply of energy is dropping. In a few hours' time, the numbers have gone off the bottom of the screen here. In a few hours' time, there's going to be no wind at all. And if the people in Fintry, despite the fact that they're net energy exporters, will actually be importing probably energy from Hunterston Nuclear Power Station. Okay. This number here is quite interesting. So far today, they've generated 1,225 kilowatt hours in Fintry, and they've used 400 of it. They've exported 1.2 thousand kilowatt hours. They've used 400. They've actually had to re-import 4 kilowatt hours, and that number is going to start rising now because the wind has dropped. Okay, so even though they're energy efficient, they produce more energy than they use, they still have to import fossil fuels from the grid. So you have to communicate with people if you want them to do things, and this is how they asked us to communicate with them. Excuse me while I switch back. This wasn't meant to happen. Okay, so there's the dashboard. So what did we actually find in Origin? What impact did it have? Well, if we just provide information to people, they will, to a certain extent, change their behaviour. Initially, they'll change their behaviour a lot, but then they're busy and they can't be bothered, and they come home from work late and they've got to pick the kids up from school, and it relaxes back to a much lower response rate. After a period of time, we ended up with a 3% bigger uptake of renewable energy, wind energy in Findhorn, simply by providing people with information about when the wind was blowing on the user interface. And that's really a bit like a smart meter. 3% effect. If you buy a smart meter and you plan your energy use around that smart meter and what it tells you, you'll get a 3% effect. And as one of my colleagues from Strathclyde University said at the time, that's only half a pair of shoes per year. It's not a lot, and I do get slightly annoyed when I see the adverts for smart meters at the moment. But if you incentivize people, so the next line down here is we added in a financial incentive. Whenever there was an excess of wind, we charged people 4 pence per kilowatt hour. When there was no wind, we charged them 16 pence. That increased the effect to the point where people could now afford the whole pair of shoes instead of half a pair of shoes once a year. A 6% effect, because cash motivates people, it keeps them engaged. So we've now got a 6% effect by changing the energy tariffs, and that's where our energy suppliers are going. We will have variable tariffs in the future depending on when the wind is blowing and when it's not. I don't think there's any way of getting away from that. Some of the houses in Findhorn allowed us to remotely control their heating systems. And we took the view that if we're going to do this, we've got to make it invisible to the householder. We don't want to disrupt their lives because this will become very unpopular. So what we did was we automated it. We started controlling the heating of hot water, and this produced an extra 10% uptake. We knew we were being successful in making this invisible when 6 weeks into the trial, one of the householders asked us, "When are you going to start controlling my heating?" So we were doing something right. And this additional 10%, giving up control means we can save you money, but you're giving up control and you'll want to override that at times, I'm sure. And this gives us a total of a 16% effect. In Portugal, they had electric vehicles. Smart electric vehicle charging system enabled them to use 10% more of their energy. If you add these together, you end up with a total effect of about 26%. But this electric vehicle effect is going to get bigger, because by 2030, we're not going to sell petrol and diesel cars new anymore. So the number of electric vehicles on the road is going to skyrocket. Right, so round about 3 years ago, we saw an opportunity to try and do some demand management in India with agricultural communities. So we asked ourselves the question, can we take this forecasting, take it to agriculture and have an impact in developing countries? And this led to a project that we referred to as SCORES, Smart Control of Rural Renewable Energy and Storage. The acronym's important, SCORES. An Innovate UK industrial research project, and it ran from 2017 to 2018, finished in April of this year, and that's in a farm in Tamil Nadu in India. This little logo here was created by one of my colleagues' daughters who came into Heriot Watt in her go to work with dad for a week at school. So Grace came in with Andrew Peacock. I'm not sure if Andrew's here. He is. Hi, Andrew. This is Grace's work. This is a logo for SCORES so that we could use it to promote the project. And the green that you see there is meant to represent the beans that we grew. So that's SCORES, and this is Tamil Nadu, the very southern tip of India, kind of facing Sri Lanka, and we were working round about there, 4 hours drive south of Chennai. This is one of the farms. It's the energy supply to the farm, photovoltaic energy. I'm sure you'll notice that. Not a lot of energy, but then these people live in a way that doesn't require a lot of energy. But what we quickly found was that the majority of the energy use on the farm was actually to run their irrigation systems. So we set out to save energy in India or use the energy more cleverly in India. But within a month of the start of the project, we'd realised this is actually about saving water, because the energy use is used to pump water in their irrigation systems. So the project moved from being about energy to being primarily about water, and that led to some fascinating results. So before I talk about that in more detail, I just want to show you some numbers about the Indian agriculture sector. It's responsible for 17% of their economic impact, but it employs 50% of the people in India. Huge forecast, a huge number of people, typically in small farms, around 100 million farms in India, and a population of about 1.3 billion. It consumes about 22% of the country's electricity, and at peak demand it takes 29%. So when they're doing a lot of pumping, it's taking 29% of the energy just to run the irrigation pumps. And at the same time, it's responsible for 80% of groundwater abstraction. Groundwater abstraction is taking the energy you need for your farm or for drinking, pumping it out of the ground. That water's been there for a long time. And if you take it out too quickly, the groundwater level drops. I know from experience that in my back garden it's 2 meters below the surface, so I don't dig below 2 meters. But in these farms in Tamil Nadu, it's over 100 meters. And some of the farms we've visited recently in China, it dropped by over 10 meters in 1 year because of this over-abstraction. And that creates a secondary problem, because if you take away the fresh water from under the ground and you're next to the ocean, then you get the salt water moving in from the ocean, and that poisons the groundwater and you can't use it. So a serious issue to the point where it might not be possible to practice agriculture anymore in these areas if they keep removing the groundwater at this rate. So, generally speaking, Indian agriculture is small farms. They've got low productivity and high water use. Okay? Generally, you want high productivity. You want a big crop yield per hectare. In India here for soybeans, so this crop here is soybeans. The orange bar here is the top 10 producers of soybeans in the world, and India is the worst of those 10 producers in terms of the number of tons of soybeans per hectare of land. At the same time, it's using more water than any other producer of soybeans. 4,000 meters cubed per ton of soybeans of water, mostly taken from groundwater. Okay? So the orange lines in each one of these crops is referring to the 10 biggest producers in the world. The black dot is telling you the situation in India when we turned up in India, and it hasn't changed yet, although we hope to change it in the future. So they're the bottom of the league for soybeans, the bottom of the league for maize, bottom of the league for rice in terms of productivity. Small yields. At the same time, they're top of the league for water use, which is a bad thing, more environmental stress. They're quite near the top for sugar. They're quite near the top for maize and for rice. Well, they're very top for maize, and they're poor for rice as well. This is in meters cubed per ton, the amount of water used per ton of crop. So it's not in a good place, India, mostly because there's so many small farms. When we turned up there, we were very wary that we didn't turn up and tell them like it is. This is how you need to do things, guys. The starting point is to listen. So we organised a series of workshops with some of the farmers in Tamil Nadu around the Oroville community where we were working. And this is one of the workshops here. It was a pleasant surprise to find that so many of the farmers were female. These are tended to be the people who were actually working in the farms, while the men were away working in the city. And that meant that we actually had a gender impact, which I'll come back to at the end of my presentation. Okay, so we set out to use the origin forecasting, so what was developed for energy forecasting, and our experience of engaging with the communities to produce an optimised and automated crop irrigation scheduling system with these Indian farmer groups, and then see what impact it had upon their water use and also on their crop yield. Here's another picture with Andrew and Michael hiding behind the ladies, and you can see they're paying rapt attention, and this is actually on the farm. So this was a precision control system. What's different between what SCORES does and what the incumbent technology does, and what precision irrigation without our SCORES technology does? Well, typically speaking, a conventional automated irrigation system, if we just displace the incumbent technology, which is manual, you turn the tap on and you leave it all day and you turn it off at night, or you leave it on all the time because energy or electricity where you are is not reliable, so you just leave the tap permanently on. That's the incumbent technology. We could displace this with a conventional automated irrigation system. So this is automated, so it'll make life better for them. They might use less energy, But that typically incorporates field sensors to measure what's happening in the field, actuators to change what's happening in the irrigation system, communication systems so that you can speak to the sensors and measure what's going on, and a software platform, and a closed-loop feedback system, typically that excludes the farmer. So you lose that connection to the local knowledge. And this is a little diagram of that. We have the crop, we have the irrigation control, typical automation system, but the farmer is excluded, and these systems tend to be expensive. So we were very aware as well of the economics of the farms. Typical annual income for these farms was the order of a few $1,000s. So we can't sell them a $10,000 system. We have to get it at the right price point. And that was critical to us making a success of this, particularly in the long run, if we want other farmers to use it. So our scores approach was farmer-led irrigation control. So the farmers involved, we listen to their needs and we allow them to tune the system. And that's a form of feedback that your machine learning can learn from. It's automated irrigation. There's a user interface so the farmer can speak to the system. There's a participatory design so that we listen and we design it for the farmers, not for ourselves. And the approach we took was that we provide the crops with the right amount of water at the right time in this irrigation system. So the crops are always happy with the amount of moisture in the soil. And it was cost engineered for affordability at a price point below $1,000. Okay, so it's affordable. And if we can set up the economics, the business model, so that people get their money back in less than a year or 18 months, then people can immediately see the benefits. So that's the scores approach. This is as technical as it gets, guys, so don't panic when you see this. I thought it would be good to put in a little schematic to describe in a bit more detail what we're doing. What you see here inside this rough rectangle with rounded edges is a cloud-based dynamic irrigation schedule platform. That's just the core of the score system. Okay? And what it's doing is it's taking our origin weather forecasts specific for that site, because we can now just input a latitude and longitude to create our weather forecasts. So we have our weather forecast, we've got data about the farm, information about the crop, and this is all in a data schema, a table of values, if you like, that's connected to the cloud. And we can use that to inform an irrigation model. And this irrigation model has an evapotranspiration model built into it, so it knows how much moisture is going to evaporate off the plants and the soil every day. And we can use that to predict how dry the soil is going to get, how much water we need to replace. Okay? It's about optimizing the amount of water. So that's the irrigation control model. Creates a signal, and the signal is sent off to a microcontroller in Tamil Nadu. And the microcontroller switches the irrigation system on and off multiple times per day. You can do it as often as you like. Okay? The feedback is from the microcontroller. You can have sensor data on the farm. So you could have a weather station there. You could have moisture probes. But they tend to make the system more expensive. They might improve its performance. We'll find out soon because we're running some new trials in India to work out just how much more expensive. But it gives you a feedback that can tune the model. But we also have the farmer feedback. With our user interface, the farmer can tell us, actually my crops need a little bit more water or a little bit less, and then the model remembers that. The next time it predicts the irrigation schedule, it will make allowances for it. And we also have the farm setup information provided via the user interface. And at the same time, we can use that user interface to send key performance indicator data back to the farm, such as your crop is going to be ready on the 7th of June, and the price you're likely to get for your okra on that date is such and such, etc., etc. And also tell them about the amount of water they've used and other such interesting things. Some of the features then, before I move on to the results. So these irrigation schedules give you bespoke daily schedules for every farm and every crop, multiple switches per day, on, off, to suit what the crop needs, because it needs a different amount of water at night than it does at midday. And we give it the right time, right volume. And this is crop, it's weather, it's climate, it's location, and it's time specific. Okay? The user interface itself is going to feed information about the irrigation system, the pumps and the valves and the pipes, but also about the water use, the crop, and the electricity that's available. Okay. This is the farm itself, the Buddha Garden in Auroville, Tamil Nadu, India. Not a big farm, 10.6 acres. Vegetables, 2.8 acres. There's some orchard, there's forest, and there's water. But they have good historic data there because the farmer is very interested in improving the performance of his farm. So he has good records, and it gives us a longitudinal data set to compare our performance against. Here they're growing maize, and these are the raised beds that he grows his vegetables in. Fully organic, and it's a small farm setup, as are most farms in India. A 10-acre farm in India is not that small. They typically could be much smaller than that. Here are the trials. We've got a manual irrigation system here. We've got the automated system in the middle, score system, and another manual system here so that we can compare performance. And during the SCORES project, we achieved 1 full year of planting, multiple crops and multiple harvests, and we're now expanding that out to 12 new farms thanks to the ROSI project that's been supported by the Impact Acceleration Award here at Her 8 Watt, and Rollout of Smart Irrigation India project. The acronym always helps. Okay, the measurement overview, we're measuring water flow, vegetative growth, crop yield, we're soil testing throughout the growing cycle, we're measuring plant nutrition and soil moisture. So, on to the results, and this is where we started to get really excited. Until you get your results, you just don't know what effect you're going to have. This is lettuce, one of the first crops that we grew. In the pilot trial, the automated system, this is the crop yield in the automated system, around about 20 tonnes per hectare. The manual system, or the incumbent technology being used now by the farmer, is here. So we've actually improved the crop yield by 20% for lettuce. This tends to be grown in the winter in India. Okay. Down here we have the water use efficiency, and at the same time you can see we've used 48% less water to produce more crop. An impressive result. 48% stress on the groundwater and more food produced for the farmer. And if this is a cash crop, that means more income. Okra. Like I said, we did multiple crops. That was lettuce. This is okra. And here we've got a 27% increase in crop yield from here to here, tonnes per hectare. And at the same time, a 30% reduction in water consumption. So it's not just lettuce. This was grown afterwards. Less water used to produce more food. And this is long bean. 70% increase in crop yield and a 76% reduction in water consumption per tonne of crop. This could have a really big effect in people's lives. If we can do it at the right price point and convince the farmers that it should be deployed right across the state and the country, think of the effect this is going to have. Big impact. But so far, we've only shown that it works. From a scientific and engineering perspective, we need to show that it works from an economic perspective, and we're working on that now. So that's long bean. We also planted maize. The maize was growing quite happily until a flock of parrots decided to eat it. So we have no results for maize, but we're planting maize in China in June next year. Right, so water consumption. 3 different irrigation schemes were considered. One was manual irrigation, so the incumbent technology, what the Indian farmers do now. That means going to the farm, turning the valve on, going away and leaving it possibly for days. Or we could have a predetermined precision schedule created from the farmer's experience. So we could put in an automated system just on its own without the SCORES technology, and that should have an impact. It should bring down the water use. And then thirdly, we can employ our evapotranspiration model or SCORES, and we should expect to see that get slightly better. And when we modelled that, this is what we found. The top is the water use for the incumbent technology, okay, averaging around about 20 to 25 millimetres of water per day. We automate it. This is the effect of putting in an automated system, moving away from manually switching things on and off. And this is what happens when you build in our scores optimization system, including an evapotranspiration model. Quite an impressive effect, even if I do say so myself. And this is very much a team piece of research. I can't emphasize enough how this could not be done by me alone. It's all about building a team of different areas of expertise that come together to make this research work. We set out to save energy. We did that as well, because if you're pumping less, you use less energy. And this is what we have here. This is a manual system, used about 6,000 kilowatt hours per annum on that 3-acre vegetable farm. If you automate it, that will drop down to 2,600 kilowatt hours per annum. And if you build in scores, you'll use 1,400 kilowatt hours per annum. So about a quarter of the energy that you would use using the flood method. This is a farm, and what the guy's doing here is he's measuring 2 okra crops. The one on the left and the one in the middle were planted on the same day. The one on the left had scores technology watering it, controlling the system, and the one in the middle had the incumbent flood irrigation methodology. And you can see the difference in the height of the crop, which is what we're trying to show here with a tape measure. And what you see on the right-hand side is the okra. This is okra. So what does it mean for the farmer? An earlier harvest, and that's good because they get the checks earlier, they get the money, or they get the food earlier. Greater yield, they get more food per hectare. That's an economic impact on its own. Also, when we tested the food, this is not a result we expected, but when we tested the food for nutritional value, we found it was higher for the score system. Because if you flood irrigate, you wash the nutrients out of the soil. So by reducing the amount of water applied to the soil, you improve the nutritional value of the food. There's no point in producing lots of tasteless okra. It has to have flavour, it has to have nutrients as well. But we did, when we tested the crops, have more nutrients in almost every category. And we use less water, and we use less energy, and it costs less. And this system should sell for around about $900. And there was also a gender impact, because the ladies who run the farms told us they were delighted, not so much with the scores technology, although they're happy with that as well, but they were delighted that they could control the irrigation system from their smartphone, from their home, because that meant they didn't have to leave the house at night and early in the morning on their own to go and switch the irrigation system on and off. So there's a gender impact there as well. We didn't expect that. What we ended up getting was more crop for less resources. Thank you for listening.